There's a story of a rabbi in the Talmud named Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan lived in the 3rd century, and he was known for being incredibly intelligent, with an intellect far surpassing those of his colleagues. But that's not why he's most noteworthy in this particular story, because Rav Yochanan in the story in the Talmud happens to have a particular superpower, which is that he's able to heal other people. And he does so by walking up to them, an alien person who has some kind of sickness, and holding their hand, and then they suddenly stand up and they're healed. And this is quite surprising for many reasons, but the story goes on to say that Rav Yochanan himself fell ill. And what happened was, another rabbi, Rav Chisda, came and did the exact same thing that Rav Yochanan did, and that is he grabbed his hand, held it, sat with him by his bedside, and miraculously, Rav Yochanan was healed. And so the rabbis see this story and they ask several questions. Surprisingly, they don't ask, how is it that Rav Yochanan had superpowers? That was my question. But instead, they ask a really provocative question, and that is, why was it that Rav Yochanan didn't just grab his own hand and heal himself? Why did Rav Hanina, this other rabbi, have to do the healing for him? And as they typically do, they answer with a very wise piece of Talmudic wisdom. They say, Ein chabush matir atzmo mi beit avadim. And that means a prisoner is not able to free himself from prison. That person depends on another in order to release him from shackles. Again, a prisoner is not able to release himself from prison. Well, the Talmud doesn't mention what ailment Rav Yochanan is suffering from. I want to suggest that Rabbi Yochanan is a prisoner of loneliness. And the key to unlocking the shackles of loneliness begins with the touch of another, be that metaphorically or literally. I recently finished a book by one of my colleagues, Rabbi Mark Katz, who's a rabbi at the other temple, Beth Elohim, in Brooklyn, New York. And Rabbi Katz wrote this book on loneliness called The Heart of Loneliness, and that's why I've been thinking about this particular issue. It's an incredible book which I highly recommend. And Rabbi Katz highlights the many places in our lives that we might experience loneliness. He says that some feel loneliness after losing a loved one, others after losing a job. We feel loneliness when we move to a big city away from friends and family. Many in their early 20s and those young adult years, after having lived 4 years in the comforts of college, move away to a new place, perhaps a big city, and aren't able to find a particular group to connect. And there are even those who feel alienated and lonely, trapped by sickness or an aging body. And of course, our tradition has no lack of lonely forefathers. There's, of course, Abraham, who's the only monotheist of his time, who's this outspoken guy who, of course, feels lonely in his beliefs, not being able to share his religion with others around him. To also, in this week's Torah portion, at the very beginning of the Torah, Adam, who's perhaps the loneliest of all. Adam, who lives in the Garden of Eden all alone before Eve is created. And in recognizing Adam's loneliness, God proclaims a simple truth that frames the search for connection. God says, Lo tov ha'adam lehiyot levado. It's not good for people to be lonely, or not good for people to be alone. And as we know, God then goes on to create Eve, a companion for Adam, to fill that void of loneliness in his life. Now, Adam's loneliness isn't cured by him turning inward to process his own emotional state. It's cured by him connecting with another person. And while that might seem obvious, it's not always intuitive to human instinct to turn outward. There's an irony that people who have known tragedy, those who are in crisis, people who are bereaved or even feeling depression, tend to be inclined to dealing with their loneliness by turning inward. Hence the notion of self-help, books that help us figure out how to deal with our own issues, our own loneliness. And this is where Judaism, I think, offers some deep, profound wisdom. Judaism pushes us to think beyond ourselves, to remember that it's not good for people to be alone. And while mourners might have a tendency to retreat into themselves, or our tradition compels us to surround the mourner with love. We're commanded to visit the sick and make sure that those who are lonely have a place to connect with someone else. And now more than ever, loneliness affects our society. A recent study, in fact, showed that 48% of respondents today had only one close confidant. And that number 25 years ago was 3 close confidants. It's not just pervasive, it's also not a small issue. Studies have shown that lonely individuals are more likely to take their own lives. Other studies highlight that chronically lonely individuals have lower functioning immune systems, higher rates of heart disease. And one recent article explained that loneliness is so detrimental to our health that it might in fact be more dangerous than obesity, than alcoholism, or even smoking 15 cigarettes per day. We don't always see this loneliness. It's often hidden. It's there, though. And as Rabbi Katz points out in his book, Facebook is going to show us the 5 friends who've just gotten engaged or the 5 friends who have just been married. But it's not going to show us the 10 friends struggling with single life. We see pictures of babies, but we rarely ever see stories of infertility on Facebook. Because the solution to loneliness isn't having more friends on Facebook or even logging on more. I want to suggest that it's figuring out how to connect with someone else, how to connect with community in a way that's much deeper and much more profound. 2 are better than 1. The wisdom of Solomon teaches us. And he says, because if one falls down, the other is able to pick the other up. How much more so with community? When one is falling down or one is feeling lonely, a community is there to bring you connection. And when I talk about connection, again, I'm not simply talking about surrounding yourself with people. I think of the story, which I read in high school, of Jay Gatsby from The Great Gatsby. I'm sure a lot of you read it in high school. We have a couple high school students here tonight. And Jay Gatsby is incredibly wealthy, throws these lavish parties, surrounds himself with hundreds of people only to mask his loneliness. That's not connection. That's not community. Connection comes when we sit face to face with someone, when we create a space for one another to feel acknowledged and heard, and when we are present for each other. We can lift one another up. We can lift each other out of a place of loneliness to a place of comfort. And in thinking about this issue of loneliness, perhaps one of the most profound stories that resonates with me happened a couple years ago during our Havaya trip to New York, trip with our teens to New York City. And we were engaged in a program called Midnight Run, where we went on the streets and handed out food, clothing, and toiletries to homeless people on the street. But more importantly, we connected with people who were homeless by listening to them, talking to them, and hearing their stories. I reminded our teens that every single day, these individuals sit on the street, and people walk by them and pretend they don't even exist. Someone might ask them a question, and people do their best to continue walking without even a glance. How utterly lonely this must be. How utterly lonely. And the day after the midnight run, we were back on walking around New York City in a group of about 40 people, 40 teens, walking down the street, and I noticed that there was a group straggling behind. And at first I felt frustrated and trying to keep the group together. So I walk back to the tail of the group, and I see a group of several teens talking to a homeless man on the street. Because more than anything, they learned that connection with this man would be so much more meaningful to him than simply dropping spare change into his jar. It's not good for people to be lonely. This is the reminder that we find in the Torah, and we cannot unlock our own shackles of loneliness. The rabbis add several hundred years later. My charge for us this evening is several-fold. First, if you're feeling lonely, seek out connection, seek out community, and find your place here at TBE. Secondly, if you know someone who struggles with being lonely, reach out to them, connect, and be present. And lastly, I want to share that everyone goes through periods of loneliness in their lives. It's okay to feel lonely at times. After all, loneliness is the force that drives us to form friendships. It pushes the divorcee to pursue love again. It pushes young adults to join a sports league. It brings people who are bereaved to find support. And to some degree, loneliness is the engine that drives people to connect here at TBE. Because TBE is a community where you should never feel alone. Shabbat Shalom.